Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be tackling the wild world of anarcho-capitalism.
It's a mouthful, isn't it?
It is. It sounds a little paradoxical, like anarchism and capitalism. How do those even go
Oh,
together?
right.
But it's a really fascinating blend.
Yeah.
Imagine a world like completely free from government. Everything from law enforcement, road maintenance, all handled by private companies and individuals.
Mm.
Our guidebook for this deep dive is going to be Anarcho-Capitalism, Principles, Practices, and Critiques, an academic paper that breaks down this unconventional ideology.
I think unconventional is putting it mildly.
It is. So
Yeah.
get ready to challenge your assumptions about the role of government, because we're going deep into a vision of a completely stateless society.
I think what's so intriguing about anarcho-capitalism is it really challenges how we usually think about societal order.
Right.
It really asks, can a society even thrive without a central governing authority?
Yeah, how would that even work? What happens when someone breaks the rules? Who steps in to ensure justice and safety?
Well, imagine for a second that your personal space, like your home, is a fenced-in yard.
Okay.
No one can enter without your permission, and you're responsible for what happens inside those boundaries. And this idea really illustrates the non-aggression principle, or NA, which is like a core concept in anarcho-capitalism.
Okay, so it's really emphasizing the idea that you can't initiate force against others, but you also have the right to self-defense and property protection.
Exactly. It's like that balance.
Yeah.
And anarcho-capitalists believe this extends to all aspects of society. So instead of relying on a government to provide services, they picture this free market where everyone, individuals and private organizations, they all interact voluntarily and exchange goods and services.
So, but how would something like law enforcement even work in a stateless society? Would we have private security firms patrolling the streets like we see in all these futuristic movies?
That's exactly the idea.
Yeah.
You choose your own security provider. You could have different companies offering varying levels of protection, and you could just select what best suits your needs and your budget.
So it's more like choosing a cable package, but for your security.
Kind of, yeah. So, having that power to choose your protection rather than relying on a one-size-fits-all government police force.
Okay, but wouldn't that just create a system where wealthy people have the best security and the poor are left vulnerable?
That's a great question, and that's a core criticism of anarcho-capitalism.
Yeah, of course.
That without government regulation and these social safety nets that we have, that the free market could just worsen inequalities and leave the vulnerable people really at a disadvantage.
So how do anarcho-capitalists address this concern? They wouldn't just want to leave people behind, right?
Well, they argue that a truly free market would actually lead to more affordable solutions, more innovative solutions for everybody, even for those with limited resources. So, for example, imagine instead of a government-run healthcare system, you might have a bunch of private healthcare providers all competing for customers and potentially driving down costs and improving quality. And they believe that private charities and these mutual aid organizations would step in to provide social safety nets.
But couldn't that also lead to a really fragmented, unequal system where the quality of the healthcare you get just depends on your ability to pay?
That's where the debate really gets interesting.
Yeah.
Anarcho-capitalists, they do acknowledge there needs to be ways to prevent monopolies and ensure a level playing field. But the solutions that they usually suggest rely on the self-regulating power of the free market.
So essentially they're saying that competition and individual choice will lead to a more just society for everyone. But that's a pretty bold assumption, isn't it?
It is.
It's hard to just ignore the history of unregulated markets and how those can lead to exploitation and power imbalances.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge those criticisms. Because understanding the nuances of anarcho-capitalism is crucial. It's not just about eliminating government. It's about reimagining how society functions and how individuals interact and cooperate without that central authority.
So it's a huge shift in our thinking. So how would this even work practically? Can you imagine a world without any government at all?
Let's try to picture that. To really grasp what anarcho-capitalism might look like in action, let's imagine a typical day in the life of someone living in a completely stateless society.
Okay, so paint me a picture. You wake up in this anarcho-capitalist world. What's different? What's the first thing you notice?
I think one of the most immediate things you'd probably notice is that there's no government-issued currency.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, you might be using all sorts of private currencies, maybe backed by gold or cryptocurrencies or even other commodities.
So like instead of dollars and cents, we're talking about what, like Liberty dollars or gold standard coins.
Exactly. You could have all sorts of interesting names and systems. It'd be a collector's dream.
That's pretty wild. So no more Federal Reserve calling the shots on monetary policy. It's just a free market for money where competition, in theory at least, leads to stability and innovation. But wouldn't that be incredibly volatile? Think about how much the crypto market swings even now.
That's definitely a concern. Some people argue that a decentralized system with these competing currencies could actually give you more financial freedom and more tailored solutions for different needs. But others worry about the potential for instability, for fraud, especially without any regulatory oversight.
It sounds like a real high risk, high reward kind of situation.
Yeah.
And what about things like roads and infrastructure? Who would be responsible for building and maintaining those in a stateless society?
Well, instead of having these big government-funded projects, you might see privately owned and operated roads.
Okay.
And these roads would be funded through things like user fees or tolls.
I see.
You could imagine subscribing to a road network just like you subscribe to Netflix or Spotify. You could choose the one that fits your travel needs and your budget.
So instead of potholes and traffic jams, we'd be complaining about subscription fees and service outages. That's an interesting trade-off. But, this whole system hinges on the assumption that these private companies will always act in the best interest of the public. What's to stop them from cutting corners, prioritizing profits over safety, or even doing some really unethical things?
That's where the idea of reputation and consumer choice really comes in. Anarcho-capitalists believe that in a truly free market, companies that don't meet customer expectations or that do engage in harmful practices, they would just be driven out of business by their competitors.
So it's like a survival of the fittest model, where companies are constantly trying to offer the best services to attract and keep customers. But that still relies on consumers being informed and making smart choices. What about things like education and healthcare? Would those be completely privatized too?
That's right. In an anarcho-capitalist society, education could take many forms, from traditional private schools to more innovative models like online learning platforms or apprenticeships. And healthcare would also function as a free market, with a wide range of providers competing for patients.
But wouldn't that create a system where access to good education and healthcare depends mostly on your financial resources?
Yeah.
How would they stop a situation where wealthy people get the best services while everyone else is stuck with subpar options?
That's a really important point. It's one of the main criticisms of this system, and there's no simple answer. Anarcho-capitalists often argue that a free market, without all those government regulations, would actually lead to more affordable and accessible options for everybody. They believe that innovation and competition would drive down costs and improve quality, making these essential services available even to people with limited means.
It's definitely a different way of thinking about things. But I have to admit, I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around the idea of a society with absolutely no safety net. What happens if you lose your job, or you get sick, or you just can't afford basic necessities? What then?
Well, anarcho-capitalists believe that private charities and mutual aid organizations would step in to help people in need. They argue that these voluntary systems would actually be more efficient and more compassionate than government-run welfare programs.
That's asking a lot, isn't it? To rely solely on private charity for something as important as Social Security.
It does require a real shift in perspective. You have to remember, anarcho-capitalism isn't just about getting rid of the government. It's about reimagining the whole structure of society and how people would interact and support each other without that central authority.
It's definitely a fascinating, if a bit radical, concept. But to really get it, I think we need to put it into context. Our source material actually compares anarcho-capitalism with other ideologies, like libertarianism, socialism, and classical liberalism. What are the main things that set them apart?
It's true that these terms often get oversimplified, but seeing them side by side can highlight some really important differences. For instance, both anarcho-capitalists and libertarians tend to be against a lot of government intervention, but anarcho-capitalists take it a step further by wanting to abolish it altogether.
So it's not just about shrinking the government, it's about getting rid of it completely.
Right. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have socialism, which, as our source material shows, is all about collective ownership rather than private property. That's a huge contrast to the individualistic principles of anarcho-capitalism.
And then somewhere in the middle, you've got classical liberalism, which, like anarcho-capitalism, values free markets and private property, but still sees a role for a limited government in things like protecting individual rights and providing certain public goods.
Yes, it's all about finding that balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility.
And these distinctions really matter because they shape how we think about the way society is organized and where power lies. So even though anarcho-capitalism might seem like a fringe ideology, it actually fits within a broader spectrum of political thought. It's kind of pushing the limits of what we consider possible when it comes to minimizing the role of government.
Absolutely. It forces us to grapple with some really fundamental questions about the role of government, about individual freedom, and about the very nature of societal order.
We've covered a lot of ground. I think this deep dive has given us a good foundation for understanding the core principles of anarcho-capitalism and how it might actually work.
We've looked at its potential benefits, things like increased individual freedom and the possibility of a more dynamic and responsive market. We've also discussed the criticisms, especially concerns about inequality, social safety nets, and the risk of exploitation.
And now as we wrap up our journey, it's time to think about what we've learned and what it all means. So after all that, where do we even begin to unpack this whole anarcho-capitalist thing? Could a society actually function without a government? Or are there just some things that are better left to, some kind of central authority?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a question that's been debated for I don't know how long by all these thinkers and philosophers. It's almost like that classic nature versus nurture debate,
Right.
but applied to like the structure of society.
It really makes you think about how much of our social order, is it something that's just natural or is it something that's been shaped by, systems and rules and institutions?
Yeah, and just like that nature versus nurture debate, there isn't really a simple answer, right? I mean, the ideal balance between individual freedom and, collective responsibility, between free markets and some kind of regulation, it probably depends on so many different things.
You're right. Things like cultural values, the historical context, even like technology, they all play a part when we're thinking about what role the government should have.
It's kind of like what might work for one society might not work for another. There's no magic formula for like a perfect system.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into anarcho-capitalism, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away from this? What's the big takeaway?
I think the most important thing is to realize that anarcho-capitalism, it's like any other ideology. It has its pros and its cons, and to really judge it fairly, you need to understand both sides of the coin.
So it's not about just accepting or rejecting the whole idea outright.
Right.
It's more about, really engaging with the ideas, exploring all the complexities, and thinking about how these principles might apply to the problems we're facing today.
Exactly. I mean, we've seen how it challenges these conventional ideas about the role of the state, individual freedom, and how society is organized.
It really forces us to question our assumptions about how things work and consider, alternative models for creating a just and prosperous society.
And as you keep exploring these ideas, remember to stay open-minded. Challenge your own beliefs, engage with different perspectives, and don't be afraid to ask the tough questions.
That's what these deep dives are all about.
Exactly.
They spark curiosity, they encourage critical thinking, and hopefully they help us all become, more informed and engaged citizens.
Because ultimately, it's through these kinds of thoughtful conversations and a willingness to grapple with these big questions that we can really try to create a better future for everyone.
Well said. And with that, we'll leave you to ponder all of this. Until next time, keep on diving deep and keep those critical thinking caps on.